my introduction for you. Welcome everyone. If you're just coming in on Zoom. So my name's Dave Waddington. I'm the co-director of the Center for the Study of Learning and Performance, the CSLP. I'll just start us off today with a land acknowledgement. Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kinien'Kahaka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather today. Tiohtià:ke, Montreal is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. So welcome to our first talk in the 2024-2025 CSLP Speaker Series. If you'd like to know a little bit more about what the CSLP does, I'd invite you to visit our website where you'll find dates and times for more events like this one. I'd also urge you to follow the CSLP on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn, and to subscribe to our YouTube channel where this talk will appear soon in its recorded version. J'aimerais aussi accueillir nos membres de l'audience qui sont francophones. Étant donné que le CAP est un centre de recherche bilingue, j'aimerais que vous soyez à l'aise d'intervenir en français ou de poser des questions dans le chat en français si vous voulez. Je vais faire mon mieux afin de traduire votre question. Okay, so the way that our event today will work is that Sarah is going to talk to us for 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have a question and answer session at the end. Just like at town council meetings, anyone who asks a question will be limited to 2 minutes max. So let me introduce Sarah. Sarah Stitzlein is Professor of Education and Philosophy at the University of Cincinnati. She is the editor of the journal Democracy and Education, very nice journal by the way, and a former president of the John Dewey Society. As a philosopher of education, she engages in normative political philosophy to identify problems in democracy and to craft educational solutions. She is especially interested in the relationship between schools and democracy, as well as how to best prepare citizens in light of struggles in democracy, very apropos for today. Her most recent book was just released, Teaching Honesty in a Populist Era, Emphasizing Truth in the Education of Citizens, and that was published by Oxford University Press. In sum, she is a leading citizenship education scholar and an outstanding philosopher of education. I'm really glad that Sarah was able to join us today, and I'm looking forward to her timely talk entitled Educating Truth and Honesty, Educating Citizens in a Populist Context. Take it away, Sarah.
Thanks, Dave, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. Right before we started, I ran out of the room quickly and I said, oh, Dave, I need to go get a copy of my book just in case we might need it. So since Dave was just introducing it, I'm going to show it. He said, show it to everyone. So here we go. It's so nice when you work for years on these things and you finally go from ideas in your head to a tangible product that you can share. So the talk I'm going to be giving today comes out of ideas from this book. And as is the nature with any kind of book talk, you end up kind of giving the big picture overview of some of the key arguments, but you kind of have to kind of skip over a lot of the finer details. So perhaps we'll share some of that in the Q&A afterward, where we can kind of look in more particular at some of the ideas I want to share. You'll notice from that cover that it's all in blue. You'll see a lot of blue in my slides today. Apparently, I've learned from my publisher that blue is the color of honesty. So if you're wondering what to wear on your next key occasion where you want to be seen as honest and trustworthy, go with the blue. So let me jump right in. And I'm going to start today with the very words that start my book. It's a shortest sentence ever. Honesty matters. When we view honesty morally, we know it's concerned with having good character. When we view honesty epistemologically, it's concerned with being accurate. And we view it civically, it's concerned with how we trust each other and how we work together. Of course, we value all of those things in a democracy. Whenever citizens in a democracy face a problem or have to reach a decision or really are just trying to figure out how to live together, They ask what I see as the key civic question, and that is, what should we do? And we try to answer that question by engaging in civic reasoning. And of course, the success of that civic reasoning depends on our propensity to honestly determine and share the truth. So, in my book and in my presentation today, I want to respond to some recent struggles related to the rise of populism and post truth because they've really dramatically reshaped how honesty and truth are working or not working in our current civic and political lives. So, what I want to do today is I'm going to ask, what is honesty? How is it connected to truth? Why are both important to and at risk in democracies today? And then, how should we teach them in schools? Some of you might be surprised that while you tend to hear a lot of academics shut down populism, especially populism on the right, or maybe you've heard academics say populists just don't care about the truth. I'm actually much more open to the democratizing potential of populism. And I see some inroads between how populists use truth and how pragmatists understand it. So, in order to answer those questions that I just laid out, I'm going to explain how a pragmatist philosopher understands what truth is and how a pragmatist might cultivate habits of honesty through schooling. So rather than a more typical civics or pardon me, virtues or character-based education for honesty, a pragmatist would emphasize a habits approach, a deeply social understanding of how individuals live and act in a democracy, one that's focused on engaging in civic reasoning around shared problems. So rather than giving primarily moral motivations for being honest, pragmatism offers us civic and epistemic reasons for being honest, because those are what help us arrive at the best solutions for our civic reasoning. And I think those reasons might give us greater leverage when we're pushing back against the sort of dishonesty that is increasingly common today. We're often quick to wave our fingers at lying political leaders and call them bad people. But what I'm suggesting is it's not primarily that one's personal character is at stake, but rather one's understanding of the world and one's ability to thrive in it with others that's in jeopardy. So, honesty is actually not a concept that's widespread in philosophical literature today. So I want to take kind of a moment to understand how it's been viewed in the past. It's typically defined by philosophers as a virtue. So it's a way of living that's aligned with the good. It includes truthfulness. This means that one cares about the truth and that you tend to reliably express the truth. It also means being forthright. So you're fully open and complete when you're pursuing and sharing the truth. You don't hold back or hide or fail to disclose important bits of information. Honesty also entails accuracy. So you're seeking valid truth claims that reflect an objective state of affairs. And then finally, honesty includes sincerity. So this means being open and straightforward and telling what one genuinely believes to be the truth without deceiving oneself or others. So this traditional understanding of honesty presumes a view of truth as correspondence. So where there's a proposition that matches some objective aspect of reality. So to kind of summarize again here, this traditional view, you have an honest person who's earnestly seeking and sincerely sharing the most thorough and precise account of an objective reality. So, and they're doing so because they aim to be morally good. Now, let me interject for those who might not be familiar, coming out of my American context. So this picture here is referring to a famous tale of our first president, George Washington. He reportedly was so honest that after being told not to, he chopped down a cherry tree as a child. And when he was confronted about it, when he was facing punishment from his father, he openly admitted his act, and he said, "I cannot tell a lie." That's kind of his famous quote, "I cannot tell a lie." This celebratory account, this moralistic view of honesty, has been long standing in American folklore. And that traditional account is really reliant upon a moral atomic self who enacts virtue. But I think that sort of account is rather contextually naive. It's focusing on the character of the individual himself rather than how his behaviors might shape other people or the world around him. It also overlooks how honest behavior helps one to better understand the world and to act in it. So instead, I'm suggesting that honesty should be seen as other regarding. Rarely does honesty stop simply with just one person independently seeking or sharing the truth. Instead, honesty pushes us to consider our relationships, our trustworthiness to others, and the impact of the beliefs that we have on those around us. So when we engage in civic reasoning, when we're asking with others, what should we do? We're treating others as worthy of knowing the truth. And we should then seek and tell the truth in ways that help us understand the world and to find solutions to our problems in it. So here you start to see how honesty supports both epistemic and civic endeavors. It's giving benefits to democratic communities. It's not merely a description of one's personal character. So, as we move into thinking about populism and post truth and their impact, populism and post truth arose around the same time. They were back to back words of the year. You know, the Oxford English Dictionary and some others, Cambridge Dictionary, they have those words of the year. So, these two were back to back. They have both significantly impacted practices of honesty. So, I just kind of a brief little snippet of what am I talking about when I refer to populism. Key aspects are I'm giving kind of a pretty weak picture of populism, kind of a bare minimum here, but it sees society as divided between the people and the elite. So you have these two homogenous and antagonistic groups, an us versus a them. The people are favored because they're seen as hardworking and good and pure, while the elite, and that's people from the academy, from media, from government, they're viewed as corrupt and power hungry. So populists celebrate the common sense of the people. It comes from their firsthand experiences and their opinions. And populism taps into citizens' affect. And here I mean they're embodied in their emotional reactions. That affect is what drives political action. It prompts like minded citizens toward each other and away from other groups. Populism also takes aim at liberal democracy. So, traditional citizenship education tends to imply that if we just know the right historical facts, if we know how government works, then we can somehow achieve freedom and prosperity in this liberal democracy. Populism exposes democracy for failing to live up to its promises of justice and well being for all. Instead, it's revealing unfairness, and it's revealing hierarchy. So, what tends to unite those populists then are their shared experiences of struggle. Sometimes those struggles are ignored by the elite, and that then fuels the affective response of anger and resentment. But importantly, populists can bring forward the demands of the people. And this is an important aspect of democratization when it's done well, but unfortunately, it can go quite undemocratically when it's done poorly. So, what I'm hoping today to do is to build off the best of populism while trying to head off some of its worst tendencies. And I think one potential inroad for doing so is detecting how populists employ truth and looking for ways to improve that practice. So, a word about post truth now. This is the OED definition here you see. We've got objective facts, they're less influential than appeals to emotion and personal belief. A lot of populists demonstrate aspects of post truth, though few would overtly proclaim it as their epistemology. But what we see happening here is populists challenge an objective correspondence theory of truth. As opinions and experience take on that heightened significance, sometimes they're even proclaimed as facts. This is a way to declare authority for one's views. It's especially the case when those facts might not be aligned with the assertions of credentialed experts out there. So populism needs those um, facts in order to develop a narrative to unite the people. Those facts are what compose the narratives. So truth then is viewed in terms of these kind of conflicting and constructed but indisputable narratives that each side loyally adheres to. So those narratives are what help us explain the unjust outcomes of liberal democracy. They show how the elite may obtain more power and wealth because of their supposed access to truth, through those advanced degrees, high tech knowledge, that sort of thing. Those narratives, excuse me, those narratives then uphold the knowledge of the people. They may castigate the elite who devalue that knowledge while they're maintaining that unfair system. So, regardless of whether those facts or narratives are accurate reflections of the world, they become endorsed by populists because they're aligned with that overall political narrative and its goals. And then those facts are corroborated by others within that political tribe, within that political group. But I want to be conscious here. I know tribe bears a considerable history for First Nations and Native Americans, but I'm using this in a poli-sci sort of way, talking about political tribes as groups of political followers. So all of this populism and post-truth, are furthered by some recent problems or accelerations of problems in psychology and sociology. So I'm thinking about tendencies here like seeking out like-minded peers in our digital and our physical spaces. So things like confirmation bias, filter bubbles, echo chambers, all of that. So the components of honesty are dramatically reshaped within this populist post-truth framework. So for populists, truth-telling emphasizes the sincere way in which one expresses that narrative of the people. So this is regardless of those other aspects of honesty that I outlined a minute ago, whether they're accurate, whether they cause deception, whether they're forthright. Sincerity trumps all of that because being sincere demonstrates that one is aligned with the people. So for populists, sincerity is not focused on sharing what one genuinely believes to be the case, that original criteria I gave you a moment ago. Instead, sincerity grows out of one's personal experiences and sharing them in a way that produces an affective response in others. Often, that affective response is what strengthens that divide between the people and the elite, the us versus them. It nurtures one's identity within a particular tribe. So it's our affective response that makes things feel true. It makes the speaker sound natural or authentic. You'll hear this sometimes in the States, people say President Trump sounds like us or tells it how it is. That's that sort of affective experience they're talking about. Importantly, populists also emphasize personal experience as reliable knowledge. The individual is the arbiter of truth. There's a philosopher who calls this an epistemology. So what's happening here is populists don't emphasize taking in information from others to build knowledge or to verify truth, but instead their focus is on pushing information out, expressing personal opinion, asserting it, and pushing it outward. So those assertions often disregard how one is connected to or interdependent upon others for understanding or transacting with the world. So, why does this matter? What I'm arguing is that what we need instead is to emphasize the social connectivity of knowledge building and truth validation. So, what that does is enables us to tie epistemology with democratization. So, if we're going to revive democracy by building off the best of populism, heading off the worst, we need to build epistemic communities. So, to start to offer an alternative pragmatist framework for truth and honesty, I first have to say a little bit about how pragmatists conceive of truth. And I'm drawing heavily here on John Dewey. This is my favorite image of Dewey in the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. That kind of positioning relative to pragmatism is going to set the stage for showing some similarities between populist post-truth and pragmatist truth. And then I think those similarities can help us to attend to some of the widespread bad practices of dishonesty that we see today and hopefully steer us towards some better ways of doing civic life. So for pragmatists, truth is grounded in real people, in their lived experiences, and in their inquiry in the world. Pragmatists are going to reject that spectator theory of knowledge, where knowledge is like an accurate reflection of the world, of a representation of a fixed reality apart from human influence. Pragmatists would never take people out of the truth equation. So when pragmatists try to figure out what is true, they look at the consequences of our beliefs. They look at what happens because of what we believe. Those beliefs that are true are those that work for us. And what I mean here is they enable us to understand the world, to act in it in ways that are going to satisfy our personal needs. But they don't just stop with our personal needs in the moment. They're looking at the impact on others and in the long run as they're trying to establish what's true. So true beliefs are those that help the community to flourish. But I want to be careful here because pragmatist truth is not entirely some sort of subjective endeavor. We figure out what works through empirical experimentation. We test our beliefs in the world and we assess them in light of our lived realities. Another important component from pragmatism is fallibilism. Pragmatists recognize, hey, anyone can be mistaken at any given time. Nothing is likely true always. And when a belief no longer helps us to navigate the world, when it no longer holds up to the evidence, it's no longer true. And in that case, we have to discard it or revise it. So for pragmatists, truth has epistemic value because it helps us better understand our environment, and it has civic value because it helps us to work together to adapt to that environment or to reconstruct it so that we can figure out how to secure our well-being in it. So pragmatists situate truth within a social view of democracy. Dewey would call this democracy as a way of life, where we're concerned with how we live together. It's that civic thrust that shifts the focus from a conception of truth to an account of the importance of honesty as truth seeking and truth telling in a democracy. So it reveals that what matters more about lying or deceit is not whether one is being morally irresponsible or whether personal gain, but whether the consequences distort or derail civic reasoning. So let's talk about how pragmatists sort this out. Pragmatists turn to inquiry as the process to get at the truth. It's also how we figure out how to live together in a democracy. Inquiry starts whenever we find ourselves in what Dewey would call indeterminate situations. These are situations where we can't smoothly move through the world. We kind of find ourselves stuck in a rut, if you will. And it may be that we don't know the right answers, but it's not just a rational experience. It's one of affect. It involves our bodies and our emotions. We might feel baffled or confused or unsure how to proceed. When that happens, we turn to inquiry to help us find solutions that enable us to get out of that rut, to move forward. The way we do that is We start by focusing our attention on understanding the situation, making sense of our predicament. We have to gather some empirical evidence to figure out what's going on, but we also need the opinions and the experiences of other citizens who have been impacted. Once we then have a grasp of the problem, that next phase of inquiry entails coming up with some potential hypotheses. How do we solve it? What do we do? What should we try? And then we then test those ideas to figure out if they alleviate our struggles. We're looking for those that help us move forward smoothly. And finally, the solutions that we've come up with have to be assessed again and again. We're testing them to see if they prove satisfactory, for whom, and to what extent across time. So, what inquiry is doing here is it's helping us to establish facts. And those facts are not permanent, they're not certain, they're always open to change, especially change that comes about because of new evidence, new changes in the world around us. Facts result as what we might think of mathematically as maxims of inquiry, is that which ongoing experimentation is trending toward, but never quite reaching. My old math teacher is, I think, of asymptotes right here. You're getting closer and closer, but never quite reaching it. But those facts are better supported than just personal beliefs or opinions, in part because they're confirmed by multiple people in various contexts. So let me start to bring together now pragmatism and populism. For both, we see that truth is constructed, it's partial, it's revisable. Both care about the truth because it helps people fulfill their needs, and both take seriously the firsthand experiences of people as important criteria. So they value that common sense that comes from lived experience. This includes that which comes from feeling and acting, not just rational understanding. And I think to an extent, the pragmatist emphasis on personal experience also aligns with the populist concern for sincerity, because what rings true to us is that which matches our personal experience. We recognize it as reflecting our experience also. So pragmatists consider the affective impact of beliefs as well. They look to see whether those beliefs lead to beneficial consequences. So if a belief sparks anger and it's debilitating and it stops the group, or does the belief support them through productive change and new ideas? That's the sort of work that pragmatism is investigating. But as I mentioned earlier, pragmatists don't just stop with personal accounts, and we see this increasingly common in our post truth era. Instead, the process of determining truth connects individuals to others as we're seeking evidence, as we're trying to figure out what works and verifying this for ourselves and for others in our community. This process presents some worthwhile opportunities to bear witness to the struggles of others, and I think this is significant in a populist context where many populists feel unheard or overlooked or left behind. So pragmatism urges citizens to attend to each other in order to achieve flourishing, and then when populism goads people to choose sides, when that happens, citizens may double down on the facts proclaimed by their tribe. Instead, pragmatism is expanding tribes. It's through that process of inquiry that pragmatism shows that some facts aren't really facts because they don't hold up in other contexts or don't work for other people. As part of that more expansive community of epistemic and civic resources, pragmatists turn to some of the very elites that pragmatists, or pardon me, that populists are quick to exclude. So scientists, academics, experts. Pragmatists would warn against going too far in celebrating personal experiences without confirming them. They warn against being overconfident in the claims that we make based on personal experience. So while we see both pragmatism and populism foregrounding those personal experiences, pragmatism is trying to give, I guess, a more balanced account. Populists value that sort of everyday knowledge that comes out of one's experiences because they see it as authentic. That common sense is juxtaposed then to expert knowledge, which is viewed as illegitimate or inauthentic because it's disconnected from real life. And I think about how academics speak, right? We try to be objective or neutral, so we speak without emotion. We drone on in detail. We seem to lack sincerity. We also tend to speak almost exclusively within the ivory tower to others who share our credentials, like many of you on the Zoom call today. That sort of practice leaves populists feeling frustrated because their perspectives are undervalued or even denigrated. And then as a result, populists tend to then see liberal democracy as more of an expertocracy. Pragmatists share those concerns. They want to say, hey, all citizens have a place at the table when it comes to building and assessing knowledge. But that also includes the experts that populists are quick to write off. Those experts have some specialized insight that might help us better understand our world and improve on it. So, for anybody who's on the call today that may be familiar with Dewey, has this famous metaphor of the shoe that pinches. He talks about like the expert cobbler who knows a lot about shoes and shoemaking, but he's only able to fix the shoe at the direction of the everyday man who says, hey, here's where it's giving me a blister. Here's where it's rubbing. Here's where it hurts. Here's where it pinches. So, what Dewey's doing in this example is he's placing the expert, the cobbler, the shoemaker, in the service of the public. And it's the common man who sets the agenda for inquiry. So, what we have then is pragmatists pairing advanced scientific inquiry with everyday investigations, where scientists and citizens are learning both with and from each other at the same time. For Dewey, then, this brings about social intelligence, and it's this increased and widened participation in inquiry that improves the quality of the knowledge that's produced. So, this pragmatist reframing that I'm offering for you here today shouldn't be seen as kind of a middle ground between liberal democracy or even expertocracy and populism. It's much more inclusive. It goes beyond just listening to both sides as we're trying to figure out how to live together. And given those affinities between pragmatism and populist truth, there may be some inroads that could be harnessed to shift populists towards a more pragmatist approach, one that I think is more justified. And with that pragmatistic kind of truth, then we can move into learning how to live honestly. So, while honesty is historically and I guess more widely described as a virtue, I'm going to suggest that it's better understood in terms of pragmatist habits. And I really don't want to get too bogged down here, whether it's a virtue or not. What I'm saying is that focusing on honesty only as a virtue really misses the point when it comes to democracy as a way of life. Our focus should be elsewhere. Understanding honesty as habits offers us some significant insight that a virtue view does not, because it looks at all the daily ways in which we live out democracy. So, pragmatists are concerned with a wider array of habits that contribute to democratic living. These includes all sorts of things that shape our epistemic and our social endeavors. They're habits that make make citizens be cooperative or inclusive or reflective and adaptive. Pragmatists understand that what we see in democratic life is a reflection of widespread lived habits, not just idealized moral or intellectual virtues. So, seeing honesty in terms of habits rather than merely virtues would shift emphasis away from the moral motivations behind one's actions, behind one's practice of honesty, to the implications of honesty in one's daily life. That then acknowledges civic motivations, and more importantly, it emphasizes civic outcomes. So, most people think of habits as really dull routines. They're things that we repeat day in and day out, exactly the same over and over again. But pragmatists have kind of a unique little take on habits. They really see habits as predispositions for how we act and proclivities to act. So those habits, they start with natural urges, often in response to our environment. And as we grow and interact with the world around us, our impulses are crafted into patterns. They're molded and shaped by our context. And of course, that includes other people like our parents or our teachers. And when those behaviors serve us well, they meet our needs, we tend to repeat them, we habitualize them. Dewey makes a useful distinction, I think, that gives some kind of insight into a pragmatist notion of honesty as a habit. He says, in the quote here on the screen, the adverb truly is more fundamental than either the adjective true or the noun truth. An adverb expresses a way, a mode of acting, like a habit. A pragmatist definition of honesty is going to emphasize ways of acting, habits we perform, and that, of course, entails ongoing verification and falsifiability. So I'm arriving now at some of my key claims for today. First, here I'm saying, honesty is, if we view it as a pragmatist habit, it's that proclivity to not intentionally distort the facts, but instead to engage in ongoing thinking, behavior that's marked by forthrightness and sincerity and accuracy regarding how we seek and tell the truth. Unique to pragmatism, honesty is that urge to act in good faith, to determine truth is what works, to fulfill our civic reasoning and secure our flourishing in the world. And then finally, honesty is a disposition to consider our relationships with fellow citizens, and how the truth that we're asserting might impact them. It might help us figure out how to live together. So, habits are formed through our exchanges with others. They're stabilized and formed through our social institutions, but they remain capable of being changed because of the way that they transact with the surrounding world. Habits can also change the people who embody them as well as the world around them. We can harness them to change the environment when it presents some of the very sorts of problems that we see today, things like confirmation bias that I was listing off earlier. Habits that become stagnant or harmful, maybe let's say you're trying to solve this, engage in civic reasoning together, solve a problem, and you're jumping to hasty conclusions. We can also change conditions or environment that irritate the habit. So, a lot of habits, especially those tied to dishonesty, are pretty deeply ingrained over time through the force of our environment, especially if lying and deceit are widespread, like they are right now. So, efforts to change them through kind of direct instruction or moral imperatives, that finger pointing I was doing earlier, those don't really account for that lasting role of the environment and how it shapes us. So, to change habits, we have to intervene in ways that bring about new environments that will then positively affirm for the person, the citizen, the student, that that new pattern of behavior is worthwhile and is worthy of repeating. So rather than chiding people not to lie, we have to nurture their proclivity toward better behavior by showing them that it serves their needs well to seek and tell the truth. So, this is where education comes in. In most schools, Honesty is touched on only briefly, perhaps as a part of character education, if at all. I've been tracking this for several years with my young child. I ask him, do you talk about honesty at school? What do they teach you? I remember there was a week around first grade when they did honesty as a character trait of the week. So what I'm trying to do here is kind of fill in that gap. I want to give us kind of an initial sketch of how we might more thoroughly teach honesty and hopefully thereby improve democracy. I'm going to start to do that by putting forward a pragmatist account of habit formation to give us a way to develop honesty. And then I want to place that citizenship education within that pragmatist democratic context to provide that environment that's going to promote and nurture honesty. So, how do you do this with young citizens, K-12, higher ed? First, we have to identify and rework the bad habits. So, this includes the sorts of habits that are aligned with those problematic tendencies we see in populism today. That might mean, people aren't always forthright because it's not in their interest to share all of the details. Maybe it doesn't serve their tribe well, or it might include being inaccurate because you're trying to celebrate the narrative of the people. So, to mold and shape new habits that are aligned with truth seeking and truth telling, we have to provide a classroom environment that's conducive to employing honesty. So, we have to create experiences where students are going to witness that positive impact of truth, and they're going to see how it benefits their lives. So, we have to start with genuine opportunities to try out honesty. And then we should reflect with students about how those efforts and their outcomes cultivate proclivities toward honesty in the future. So, yes, teachers can use direct instruction about what honesty means and why it matters. And yes, they can use content and stories, examples that display honesty at work. Classes might look at past behavior of exemplars or examining, how honesty has been invoked in real life situations. And yes, modeling by the teacher can be a helpful way to kind of demonstrate honesty. So maybe the teacher might do a think aloud for students to help describe the ways that he has reached a conclusion about what is truthful in the world. But these aren't the most effective ways to teach habits of honesty. We have to set up environments where students are practicing honesty for themselves. And those environments tend to have three key features. So they're communities of inquiry, they emphasize shared fate, and they engage in reflection. Let me say a bit more about each of those. So, in communities of inquiry, learning honesty is going to start in the very same place or the very same way that pragmatist inquiry is provoked, with those real, complex, mucky, muddy, complicated struggles in students' lives. It's those meaningful contexts within them that they learn how to validate truth by determining the consequences of their beliefs on themselves and on others. So, this emphasis is on creating realistic, problem solving situations that provoke and develop habits. Such learning should be located within classroom communities of inquiry, because there students, just like citizens in a democracy, work together to answer what should we do as they're developing new understanding about their world and their agency in it. We want to empower them to form publics, to propose solutions, and to actually try them out and implement them. It's not enough just to talk about them, but to do them. Those sorts of endeavors invite the complexities and the conflicts of democracy into our classrooms. And that's a scary thing for a lot of teachers. So, in the midst of inquiry, let's say that teacher detects this kind of hasty conclusions, rush to conclusions, or maybe there's some unchecked assumptions going on. This is where the teacher is going to interject with a call to doubt or to introduce nuance. The teacher might put forward an alternative view or maybe point out some flaw with the current one that is dominating the discussion. Or the teacher might challenge evidence that appears to be overly simplified. This is a pretty common problem in populist contexts where we're looking for fast and easy solutions. So what the teacher's doing here is pushing students to pause, to bring about slower and more careful inquiry. It might mean reminding them of the importance of being inclusive of counter views or differing perspectives. We know we live in a Google knowing era. And what I mean here is children and students are seeking quick information through easy outlets like Google. Teachers have to help students see how the sorts of accounts they get from those outlets are limited in ways that are not only epistemically harmful because they're inaccurate or they're short-sighted or they're distorted, but also are civically harmful because they're biased or exclusionary. And then teachers have to nurture students' capacity for cognitive complexity, their desire for complexity. And they do this in part by showing that complexity leads to better outcomes for those students and for the people that they care about. Now, classroom communities of inquiry, I think, can really push back against some of the sorts of intellectual arrogance that lead citizens to put their opinions above those of experts or science or other traditionally trusted democratic institutions. And they do this by demonstrating some deep interconnections between classmates. So they foster a sense of how their shared fate relies on making wisely informed decisions together. So, viewing citizenship as shared fate pushes us to foreground how we're linked together by location and history and culture. And shared fate then keeps an eye toward how our answers to civic questions impact us as members of that community. It nurtures that inclination to care for others, in part because we recognize that our futures are bound up with theirs, politically and economically and geographically. So these inclusive and trust building communities provide a safer environment for sharing the experiences of class members as another potential source for evidence and solutions. And then finally, reflection. I'm talking here kind of like metacognitive reflections. These can reveal for students the process of how truth was determined during their classroom inquiry, and they can show how honesty shaped that process, helping students then to see why it's valuable to enact it. These reflections can be done verbally, but also through like journaling. Students might be encouraged to journal about the impact of instances where they've failed to be honest, where they've lied. They might consider how to head off that sort of action in the future. Teachers can use some of my favorite prompts. So they might ask, how might I be wrong? Love this one for getting at intellectual arrogance and humility. Or what makes you say that, to help students realize how they've reached the view they have. Or a prompt I like to use is I used to think, but now I think. Again, this kind of fosters an awareness of intellectual humility and of affect. And within those metacognitive exercises, students come to better understand the content of their particular beliefs, but more importantly, how they think and believe. So, relatedly, we want to be teaching affective civic literacy. And this educational approach is not just merely showing that emotions matter, but learning to question how emotions matter in the construction and the determination of truth. So, to pull this all together, I think in sum, this reflective, inquiry based citizenship education works to develop and affirm that inclination to be honest, that habit of being honest. It's through that repeated exercise that students experience the benefits of honesty. And that's what nurtures that habitual bent towards similar action when like situations arise in the future. I think that is more likely to have a lasting impact than traditional, memorization of civic content or learning about character traits or just simply being, morally goaded to do what's right. Our ability to answer that key civic question, what should we do, really relies on our ability to engage in civic reasoning, to gather information, to deliberate different courses of action, and to test out our solutions. The likelihood that we're going to arrive at answers that serve our needs, support the flourishing of our community, all depends on our disposition to honestly determine and share the truth. So I will stop there and I will open it up for any questions or comments that you might have.
Well, thanks very much there, Sarah. I think that perhaps we'll just stop sharing
Sure.
for a moment here, so that we can kind of go back to a more gallery view. Folks, please feel free to turn on your cameras, so that if you feel like it, okay, if you feel like it, so that we can just have a dialogue here. So yeah, I mean, what I figured that I do is just take questions from people. You can put something in the chat if that's how you'd most like to share your question, or you can raise your hand using, I think it's like Control F5 or something like this, or you can just there's probably some other way to raise your hand here. Yeah, it's just like a raise hand button. Simpler than the keystroke. But anyway, yeah, so raise your hand, or put your question in the chat, and Sarah will be delighted to answer it. We've got a question period potentially, okay, till 5:30. I don't know if we'll end up going that far, but please have at it. Who would like to ask the first question? All right, so Anne-Marie puts her question in the chat. She says, thanks very much, Sarah. My written English is not the best, so I'm going to write this question in French, but I will understand your answer in English. Can we say, first, she asks, can we say that truth is constructed? Just as knowledge is. So that's her first question. Can we say that truth is constructed just as knowledge is? And she says, what is the difference between truth and integrity? Okay, when we are teaching kids, how do we answer that question? How do we kind of differentiate between truth and, let's say, integrity, honesty, when we're kind of teaching it to kids? So kind of two questions here from Anne-Marie. Anne-Marie, I hope I've adequately translated your question here on the fly.
That's how I read it too. If it's been a while since I've been in a French speaking country, but hopefully we've got it great. Thank you, Anne Marie. So these are good questions. And in part, the first one really gets at pragmatism. And part of what you're pushing here, I think, is how pragmatists understand truth and the difference between truth and belief and knowledge. And I don't think I really want to make a case to you today to try to persuade you to adopt pragmatism, because you'll notice what I'm doing today is I'm trying to say, hey, let's start with where populists are at and how they're using truth. And then I'm kind of saying, I see some resonance and some similarity to pragmatist accounts. So let's kind of figure out how the pragmatists might kind of redirect and help improve that populist use. But I recognize that the pragmatist account itself is not an easy sell for a lot of folks, especially if you subscribe to a more correspondence theory of knowledge, a more objectivist account of the world and our knowledge in it. So, um, you're kind of asking, what's the similarity or the difference between those. Knowledge is, from a pragmatist, justified true belief. So it's going to turn to that kind of inquiry approach to affirm that those beliefs are valid, that they work for us, and that's what becomes our knowledge that we operate on. So there is kind of a collapsing there of truth and knowledge together. That truth is what we have to work with as knowledge because there isn't that objective world that it corresponds to. So I know that that's a pretty radically different way of understanding truth for a lot of folks. The second part of your question about the difference between integrity and truth, this one I have to think a little bit more about. And if you would like to say a word or type in the chat, I'm curious to understand more about how you understand what integrity is. Is integrity kind of the uh, is it a practice of being honest? Does it mean sticking to one's principles? Does it mean like being whole or coherent? There's kind of different understandings of what integrity is. So that might help me better understand how it's similar or different to teaching truth.
So while we'll allow you to clarify that a bit in the chat if you'd like, Anne Marie. I mean, in the meantime, how about I mean, I'll ask a question, Sarah, which is that okay, so we're talking about honesty. I mean, it's a fraught topic these days, as you correctly pointed out, because of course the right kind of badges themselves as the truth tellers, the people who tell it like it is, as you said. But I mean, what really struck me in terms of your prescriptions towards the end is that some of them, I think, veer away from what some people would conventionally understand as honesty. So, like if I ask you, you say something and you say, well, why did you say that? What makes you say that? I feel like that's not how somebody who's telling it like it is or is a truth teller, right? That's not something that they would welcome, right? They would see that as kind of attempting to kind of massage the discourse in your desired direction and asking me to unduly question my lived experience and my truth, right? So I mean, I think that, okay, if I'm a right wing critic of yours, I would say, well, this emphasis on shared fate and dialogue and reflection is all just a big liberal plot emphasizing complexity, all of this stuff. It's all just a big liberal plot to kind of take away from the authenticity of my view and to ask me to dilute my view and to ask me fundamentally not to be honest, right? So, I mean, this would be the obvious right-wing critique of your argument, which I'm sure you've probably heard like a million times already. Okay, so I mean, what's your response? What's your response to that critique? To say, well, sure, Stitzlein, you talk a big game about honesty, but in the end, it's just the same old liberal stuff that you're giving us.
Mm-hmm. No, that's good. So a couple of things come to mind. First of all, like those kinds of prompts, partly what they're doing is not just getting at honesty, but they're getting at how affect impacts what we believe is true. And so I'm trying to get people to pause to understand the role of affect and kind of intellectual arrogance that I was talking about, where we put our opinions and our experiences over those of experts or democratic institutions. So part of what I'm trying to do is kind of expose that role. And while that might not be honesty, what it's doing is it's giving us pause to understand how we have arrived at what we think is the truth and whether or not that's valid or justified. Coming to the part about what rings true or what is, they tell it like it is. I just saw a commercial for President Trump on this last final day before the election in the United States, and it literally used that phrase. He tells it like it is. Well, part of what I'm saying is, okay, let's figure out, is that true? So is what he's saying actually reflective and representative of the people? So I can keep it in a populist context and say, does that actually reflect my experience? One of the things that I've kind of pushed, most of my family are Trump supporters. And I've pushed my father on this to say my dad is a livestock farmer in rural Ohio. He's not very well off. And I've said, Dad, how is this man who speaks of golden toilets and very expensive, wealthy ways of life ringing true to your experience as a livestock farmer in a rural community that is not well off? And what I'm trying to do here is to kind of distinguish that the narrative that's being endorsed by the people might not reflect the experiences of the people, to try to call out what may not be true. And so the honesty then would be how we repeat that narrative and uptake that narrative and share it. So I think you're right, Dave, to suggest that that is kind of a right wing or a right side critique. I'm trying to actually put it within the way that the right is using truth and sincerity. I might not be as effective as I hope, but I'm trying to get there.
Well, thanks a lot, Sarah. Other questions that people have for Sarah. Bruce, I see you activating your microphone, so go
Yeah, I
ahead.
can't figure out how to raise my hand on my phone. So,
Oh, don't worry about it. You know, the technology baffles us all these days.
um, yeah, I guess I have an observation and a question. But first, I wanted to say that that was, I mean, maybe I'm not, I don't get out much or something, but that was the most like insightful and original analysis of populism I think I've ever heard. It was really, really, really insightful. But I think about, and Marie, I think it was mentioned the distinction between integrity and honesty, and your talk made me think about that a little bit. I mean, about the sort of suggestions that you make, or the recommendations about how teachers can deal with, raise honesty or encourage honesty. Of course, many teachers do that already, but I think schools, to me, tend to be like, especially contemporary public schools, tend to be sort of obsessed with integrity rather than with honesty. But by that I mean, like it's not like speaking the truth that matters. It's like doing what you said you would do, respecting your contracts, doing what you've signed up for. I think they're really huge on that. And there is, I think, a really big, it's misleading, I think, to be so focused on integrity, but I think it's somehow safe for educators. Anyway, I'd be
Yeah.
interested in what you'd have to say about that. My question, though, um, was what was my question now? Well, maybe reply to the
Yeah, let me do jump in, and then I'll give you a moment to think too, because as you're saying this, I'm thinking about so the with integrity being about kind of sticking things through, following through, not changing, and kind of this consistency. I'm reminded of in American politics. I go way back to the Swift Boat campaign with John Kerry. And this was the way that supposedly Kerry was exposed as a flip flopper, that he changed his views on things. And because of that, he was to be disqualified from office because we couldn't trust someone who changed his views. Now, there's people like me sitting at home seeing this going, wait a minute, I think I want somebody who's willing to change their views in the light of changing evidence or whatever it may be. But I suspect that this somehow gets at the sort of integrity that is valued in our political world today, that we want somebody who's going to kind of stick to a particular political agenda or a particular political narrative. And this is how I think truth is kind of working right now in populism. Like, you stick to the narrative and you just keep pounding it in. And if you diverge from it, that's when you become seen as a traitor. So a lot of this sort of hyper political polarization that's going on even turns people then away from those within their own political tribe who begin to question or challenge. And maybe that's because they're coming off as lacking integrity. They're differing from it. They're putting forward some alternative view. And then those dissenters, even within the same political tribe, get pushed out. We see some extreme examples of that in the United States, folks like Len Cheney, for example. But even much more small acts of questioning and dissent might be read as lacking integrity. That you're kind of selling out, you're trading in on the narrative that is accepted within your political tribe. That's just kind of some speculation about that. How it relates back to schools and teaching integrity, I'm not quite as confident in speculating on.
So just to follow up a bit more here, Anne-Marie has posted in the chat, and she says, with my students, I tell them that truth is a component of integrity. If I'm a person who has integrity, yes, I tell the truth, and so I'm coherent between what I say and what I do. If I'm a person who has integrity, when I make a mistake, I'm capable of admitting it. So she says, I would like to know if you if you too see integrity as see truth as a component of integrity, or whether for you truth and integrity are just the same thing, just synonyms. So I
Yeah,
hope
that's
there that I've translated your comment accurately, Anne Marie.
I think, Anne Marie, you are on point with. I think I'm seeing it more as a component of integrity rather than synonyms. I don't know that I would use them interchangeably, but certainly a person who has integrity acts honestly, and part of that honesty, as I explained, involves falsifiability, the willingness to accept when one is wrong, to change one's views. Those are certainly desirable traits related to integrity that come from being an honest person. So, yeah, thank you for explaining more about what you mean on integrity.
So who else would, any other questions here in the chat, or anyone want to make their, put up their hand or make their mic live? Go ahead, Bruce.
Well, there was the second part of my my question, which was, I mean, it strikes me that like many listening to the way young people especially talk about truth, like about in terms of matters of public concern, and I'm sure this is not exclusive to young people, but they seem to be so kind of epistemologically far gone, okay, that they may be unreachable by your suggested methods. And what I mean by that is that there's literally people, okay, who see opinions on political questions, on social questions, and environmental questions as merely a matter of opinion, right? And everyone's allowed to have their point of view, right? And we sort of have an obligation as citizens, they seem to suggest, to respect other people's points of view. And I see this to some extent related to this sort of fundamental, it's almost like a perversion of the sort of fundamental democratic principle, right? Which is that in a democracy, everyone has the right to believe whatever they want, no matter how foolish or stupid or false it is, right? So there's like a certain virtue, at least the way they're seeing this, I think. But at the same time, it's a highly problematic commitment in terms of decision making in a democracy or in any kind of collectivity.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. Maybe the element of democracy that is the starting nugget is this idea of pluralism, and that we celebrate an array of good lives and worldviews, and that we allow people to pursue a whole host of those in a democracy, and that there's something respectable and admirable about that. But when we fail to check or account for those worldviews and their impact on the world, when we just kind of let them be as everyone's opinion, that's where I want to call on pragmatism to say, does holding X, Y, and Z worldviews all play out in positive ways that impact our world in good ways? Do they cause problems? Do they have shortcomings? And I think right now, you're right that the tendency amongst many youth is just kind of be a hands off, kind of relativist approach of just live and let live. I want to engage more questioning, and you'll notice I come at this not as moral questioning, but more about civic questioning. Like, does this way of this worldview or this view of the good life cause some problem for our ability to work together, to resolve problems, to solve problems that we're facing together? It's not so much about, is that a good or a bad or an appropriate worldview, but does it cause some problem for our society? So let's say it's a worldview that's one that's based on uh, a racist understanding of certain populations. I'm not going to make the case about, you know, I probably would in some context, but here I'm not making the case about that as a moral fault. And, you might be able to kind of throw up your hands and be like, well, they believe what they believe. I'm going to say if civically that causes problems, to hold that view of racism toward others, and I could show how that plays out in our inability to work together to solve common problems to lead to a flourishing life for others, then I'm going to say then we can't just throw up our hands and say live and let live. We have to interject to revise and rework that view. This is the pragmatist in me coming out. There's a pretty long-standing literature. Bob Talese, who's a pragmatist at Vanderbilt, has some excellent work on whether pluralism even fits within democracy from a pragmatist worldview. So I point you toward his work. But in terms of are the students too far gone, you're right to kind of push me on the practicalities here. There are students who are really far down that track, and whether we could kind of turn them back, I don't know. I appreciate that kind of practical call for me to check maybe some of my rose-colored glasses outlook on that. Thanks, Bruce.
Okay, folks. Do we have any other people in our audience today who'd like to ask Sarah a question? Well, I mean, I'm not hearing a clamor, so I'm going to ask you another question there, Sarah, which is, okay, so for in a lot of our work, the work that Bruce and I do, I mean, we think about, well, what are the limits of classroom discourse? You know, what can people actually say? When, as a teacher, do you need to intervene? How honest can you let students be? And, you know, I mean, there's a lot that's been written about this by people like Sigal Ben-Porath and Eamon Callan and Barbara Applebaum. Like, so how much honesty do we kind of allow to prevail in the classroom, right? I mean, is a degree of honesty, as Eamon Callan says, really critically important, where you kind of let people air their views, even if they may be ill-informed views, right? And you say, well, you know, I mean, that's actually a highly problematic point of view that you're sharing there. I mean, you may think this as the teacher, but you let the student share it anyway for the sake of classroom discourse and for the sake of kind of cultivating the virtue of honesty in some sense in, you know, kind of dialogical approach in your classroom. So yeah, where do you come down on that kind of question?
Oh, this is a good question. A hard question to answer because my inclination is to say I kind of want to side with Eamon Callan and others who are more open to airing of those views. But where I become increasingly concerned is there's a difference between airing views that are about matters of the world. So I have a friend who's a flat earther. Okay, I'll listen to him, tell me about why he is a flat earther. That's different than making a case that is an attack on another person's humanity. And that's where it becomes more worrisome to me, and the airing of truth in that way. I'm reminded this was some 20 years ago when I first started teaching, that there's a moment in my own university teaching that still sticks with me today where I came down hard on a student who was airing a view of this kind. So I had a joint appointment between women's studies and philosophy, and I was teaching an introduction to women's studies course. I was teaching about the history of um, contraception and how it enabled strong growth in the workforce for women to be able to control their fertility and reproduction. And in the midst of sharing this, we were talking about the 1980s and changes in the economy as women were able to use contraception en masse. And a white male student in the classroom raised his hand and he said that Black women should be sterilized because they should not be entrusted to have children. They were not worthy of having children. And having Black women in the classroom, let alone my concern for Black women elsewhere, I came down very hard on this student. And I basically said, no, like that is just not going to fly in this space, because I felt a strong obligation to stand up for the basic human rights of reproduction of the Black women in my class at that time. But what sits with me 20 years later is that student never participated another time the entire semester. I came down hard, his hand went down, and I never heard him voice something again. And so, where I've had to rethink that is what is the space for airing views, even those that are harmful, as an education invitation to ongoing conversation, to continuing to learn, to exchange. Because when I came down hard on him, it wasn't just that he stopped participating, he also stopped listening. He was no longer going to be receptive to what I had to hear. So, when I think about those kinds of hard questions, Dave, I have to think about not just what are we allowing to influence the deliberation in our classrooms, but what are we doing educationally to cut off conversation? So I'm more inclined, for example, to think of the sorts of civility that someone like Tony Layden call for, where civility is not just like being polite or following the rules or being kind in conversation, but having an inclination to continued conversation and opening to continuing to interact. And that's what I lost in that moment when I shut that student down.
Well, thanks, Sarah. I mean, that's a really interesting anecdote and an interesting case, I think, for some food for thought there for all of us. So, any other questions that folks would like to pose to Sarah? Go ahead, Marisa.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you very much. It's been amazing, and my brain opened in a lot of different ways. But I was curious to ask, in retrospect, as you were telling this anecdote, do you have any thoughts on how you might handle that today?
Yeah, I think I would probably be a little bit more willing to challenge how did you come to that conclusion? The same way, the same kinds of prompts I was just talking about using. Let's talk about why he's reached that view. Is this just sheer racism? Is there something that he's unearthing about some view that's held widespread in our community? Is there something, we were talking about President Reagan and his use of the term welfare queens. What is that imagery and why was it so captivating for many people at the time and continuing today? So I think I would I would engage it more than I might have 20 years ago, but I'm still quite concerned about how to do that in a way that preserves the well-being of those women who were witnessing this comment in the classroom. And I also, I think, would want to signal for those women that I'm not on board with this view, that I find it problematic, that I'm not endorsing it by giving it some space in our classroom. I'd be hesitant to allow it to have a soapbox to kind of take over the discussion or to platform that student in a way that he becomes kind of a speaker of this racist view. Um, I don't know. It keeps me up at night. I still haven't figured out the perfect solution, but I think that's why the sort of work that Bruce and David are doing is so important for us to figure out how teachers should handle those complicated moments when they unfold in those kind of controversial discussions in classrooms.
Thanks there, Sarah. Other thoughts, other folk questions that folks have for Sarah? Can make your camera live. All right, or you can put something in the chat. Well, look, Namat, go ahead. Please make your camera live or make your mic live.
Hello, hi.
Hi.
I have I have a question, please. I do agree that honesty is a very essential attribute, but I also believe that no harm is also very high value attribute. So when we are giving kind of hierarchy to one value in front of another, it becomes another, from my perspective, conceptual idea. So sometimes, since both these values are important, but sometimes you cannot achieve them at the same time simultaneously, right? So they can conflict with one another. What would you do in this case?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, Namat, this is a tough question, a long-standing one in ethics. So, like, even when I'm teaching my ethics course and I'm talking about Kant's famous example, right? When the murderer comes to the door and knocks on the door and he's looking for your friend, is it better to be honest and tell, why, yes, my friend is, hiding in the kitchen. Come on in, let me get him. Or is it better to do no harm and to protect your friend by lying and saying, nope, haven't seen him, not here, go on to the next house? Those things come in conflict in life and death situations, as well as really mundane ways, right? When your friend says, "Does my dress look good on me?" and no, that dress isn't so flattering, but you don't want to say that because you don't want to hurt your friend's feelings, but yet you're also aware that you don't want to harm your friend by sending them off, to the party in their dress that's not a good choice. So we face those kind of trade-offs often. I'm not sure that I have an easy answer for when we prioritize one over the other, what kinds of harm are significant enough that maybe they outweigh honesty. We're being pushed on this in the United States right now, given that some of our political leaders are making false claims that are really putting some people in significant harm. I live in Cincinnati, Ohio, which is about an hour from Springfield, Ohio, which is the community that President Trump and Vice President candidate Vance have claimed, where the immigrants are eating pets. And while that sounds like a rather mundane falsity, it's played out in some really harmful ways. So there's been, last count I knew, 33 bomb threats on local schools. The university had to be closed down. The children had to be evacuated from the school. Those are real heavy consequences of harm that are playing out on what would seem to be a rather, I don't want to belittle this. This is a significant false claim being made about a population, but compared to the murder at your door, perhaps are lesser scale. So we're really struggling with that. And for me, and in that case, I'm going to clearly make a case for honesty, but it's not always so cut and dry. Thank you.
Thanks, Namat. Would anyone else like to ask Sarah a question? Okay, well, it's almost 20 past 5. I think we've asked a number of really interesting questions, both in the chat and live. And Sarah, thanks so much for your thorough and thoughtful responses. And I'd like to thank all of you in the audience for joining us here today online. Please, as I said in the introduction, check out the CSLP website, subscribe to our newsletter, watch our Facebook and Twitter spaces and LinkedIn for more events like this one, because of course we're going to have lots of interesting events coming up. I think we're going to have one with Bruce soon, for example. So yeah, and thanks so much, Sarah, for joining us here today. We really, really appreciate your terrific insights on this absolutely critical topic.
My pleasure. Thanks to all of you for coming. I really appreciate your time and attention.